We are on Tzadi Chesamid Beis, and as you remember, we saw machlokas whether the beams of the Mishkan, had depth at the top, or were they only a finger breadth? In other words, according to one opinion in the Gemara before, Rabbi Nechemia, the beams actually were the same size at the bottom and at the top, and so at the top also there was a depth. So when the curtains went over the top to cover the Mishkan, so there was 10 amma wide in the center, in the space, and then an amma on each side for the depth of the beam itself. So just to cover the top, you would need 12 amma. And since it was 28, it would only hang down another 16, meaning 8 on each side. And since they were 10 amma high, tall, then you would have the bottom 2 amma at the bottom, an amma for the base and an amma of the gold cover of the beam itself. However, according to Rabbi Yehuda, where the top of the beam actually was on an angle, and it came down to just a finger breadth. So then it was hanging down, and even though it was hanging somewhat on a slant, but it didn't take up the full cover size of the cover, and so it would hang down almost entirely to the base, to the Adanim, and you couldn't really see much gold because it would come down almost all to the end. So the Gemara says that's the way it was. We are now in the second wide line. Sorry, the fourth wide line. The Mishkan Kamahava, the length of the upper cover, which was called the Mishkan. Sorry, what about the length of the Mishkan? The length of the Mishkan was 30 amma on the inside. So again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you had 30 amma the length of the Mishkan. On top of that, besides for the length of the Mishkan, you also had, so according to, you had the length of the Mishkan, which was 30, because it was 20 beams of 1.5 each. So you had 30 on the inside. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, you also had, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since it was on a slant, you didn't have another amma there. So you just had 30, and then it would hang down straight because you had 10, and the length was 40. However, according to Rabbi Nechemia, where you had the cover was 30, but you also had an additional for the depth of the beams in front, so that was 31. And so when it hung down, you only had 9 left, and so the base was uncovered. So you have 30 for the roof, for the ceiling. Pashaluhu yud, so you're left with 10. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, which didn't have the depth of the beam on the top, so therefore it would cover the base because you had a full 10 amma to go down the western side of the Mishkan. L'Rabbi Nechemia megalia amma da'adanim. According to Rabbi Nechemia, the one amma of the base was uncovered. Then on top of that, there was a goat skin, or a goat hair covering. That was called the Yiriyah Se'izim. La'oel. Orach ha'yiriyah acha shlosha ma'ama. So there, and again, these were also made of strips of curtain that was sewn together. Each panel being 30 in long, and in the end, it ended up being 44. So it says like this: Shlosha ma'ama. The length of each was 30 amma. Shadi urchayu laput to the Mishkan. If you take the length of them to the width of the Mishkan, kama hava taltin. It's a total of 30. Dal eser. You minus 10 for the cover of the Mishkan. Leigra pashalu eser lahai gisa eser lahai gisa. You have 10 remaining for each side. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the beams themselves at the top did not take up any space, just a finger's breadth. So then you have the full 10 to hang down on the sides. So it can even cover the base. However, according to Rabbi Nechemia, since you needed one amma on each side for the depth of the beams themselves, you're only left with an additional 9 on each side, and so the base was uncovered, and you can see the copper base. Tani and Amahachi, indeed, we see this. And there was an additional amma on each side, excess to cover the adanim. Different Rabbi Yehuda, that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. However, no, it only covered the last amma of the beams, but not the base themselves. All right, what about the length? Shadi putye le'urke, but the width of each one of the curtain panels covered the length of the Mishkan. Kama hava mem, the length of the Mishkan was 40. Va'arba, and the length of the curtains were 44. Dal taltin le'igra, so there's 30 for the cover of the Mishkan itself, the open space. Pashaluhu arba sari, so you have an additional 14. Dal tarti lechifla, there was 2 which hung in the front. So the front entrance of the curtain of the opening had a cover of 2 amma from the goat covering that was hanging over the front. So that's this. So you have 32 already taken care of. Then you'd have, according to Rabbi Yehuda, where they were on a slant, it would immediately go down the western side of the Mishkan. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Nechemia, it would cover also the last beam and then go down. So the like it says that the 6th curtain hung over the front of the tent. So you're left with an additional 12. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it says that the remaining 2 would hang down on the other side. So that's where it means that it was hanging. What does it mean? Tisrach it hangs a little more, but it still is not totally hanging over and like the back. And in the Academy of Rishmol, they taught Lama Mishkan Daima. What is the Mishkan similar to? Like a woman walking with a gown in the street, and the train of her garment is dragging along on the ground beneath it. So to the Mishkan, in the 2nd curtain, it came over, it hung over the front, 2 amma, but it also dragged along behind it another amma or 2, according to these 2 opinions. So, the beams themselves, they had legs, they had indentations. So according to Rashi, basically it had these 2 legs coming out that were carved out of the wood. And the base, the adanim, had sockets for which they would go into, and that's served as the base support in it. That's the way Rashi takes them. And additionally, in the curtains themselves, the curtains were made of these panels, and each one of the panels were sewn together. And then there was 5 on one side and 5 on the other, or 5 and 6, according to in the first curtain or the second curtain, the first level, the second layer. In any case, the half of them was sewn together, and the other half was sewn together, and then they were attached by basically like hook and eyes, and so it looked like this glistening stars in the center, running across the center of the Mishkan from these hooks that were there. So this is the karasim balulois kekachavim barakia. They look like stars in the sky. We are now on 99a Tzadi Tes Amud Aleph, and the Gemara is going to tell us the makeup of these curtains. The lower curtains were made of blue wool, purple wool, red wool, and white linen. And the upper one was made out of goat skin or goat hairs. And the wisdom, the ability to build, to construct the lower ones were great, but not as great as creating the upper curtain made out of the goat hairs. Because by the lower one it says, it says, and every woman of a wise heart, she used her hands to spin this. But by the other one, but the upper one, it says, and all the women whose heart has carried them. So this is a higher level of wisdom. With wisdom, they spun the goats. And why does it say they spun the goats? They washed the goats, and they spun the hairs directly off of the goats, and they didn't shear it off and then spin it. So now we get to the Mishnah, which said that if there were two porches, one hanging over the public domain, and in between was Rishus HaRabim. So Amar Rav Mishum Rabbi Chia, Agolis Tachtena B'neim V'tzidem Rishus HaRabim. The wagons that were used to carry the beams in the Mishkan, as we talked about on Friday, and so those wagons beneath them, between the wagons side by side, and between the wagons in front and behind them, were all considered Rishus HaRabim, public domain. Amar Abaye. So Abaye explained. Between the each wagon was the same size as the length of the wagon. So the wagon itself was 5 amma, and behind the wagon was another 5 amma open, and then the next wagon. So there was an opening of 5 amma, the same length as the wagon itself. V'kama orach hagala, and how long was each wagon? Hey amas, 5 amas. Lamali. Why do I need 5 amas? B'dala palgasagi. It would be sufficient to just have 4.5. Why did you need 5? As we explained on Friday, that the wagons had the beams laying across them, in the perpendicular to the wagon. So if the wagon itself was running, say, east to west, so then the beams were laying north south. Well, if it's 5 ammas and each one of the beams itself is an amma and a half wide, long, it's an amma and a half by an amma. So either you had 3 of them, and then they would take up 4.5 amma, or you had 4 of them and they took up 4 amma. But either way, you didn't need a full 5 amma. So the question the Gemara has is, why do you need 5? You only had a need for 4 amma in the length of the wagon, so that perpendicular to that you can lay the beams down at either 3 or 4, and it would only take up 4.5 amma max. So the reason is because we want to make sure that the beams don't bang into each other, they crush into each other, and that would damage the beams. And as Rashi points out, and you also had the hooks, the rings with which the support beams went through, and those also took up space if you had them on their side. Amar Rava, Tzidei Agala, the sides of the wagons, Kamloi Rechav Agala, was the same width as the width of the wagon itself. V'kama Rechav Agala, Shtei Amos HaMechza. How wide was the wagon itself? 2.5. So here we're going to first explain Rashi, and then I'll explain it according to Tosis. Rashi learns there were 2 wagons side by side. Each one of the wagons was a total of 5 amma wide. But the wagon itself was 2.5 amma wide. And then on each side, it had the axle holding the wheels. So that was another amma and a half on each side. So an amma and a quarter on each side, totaling 2.5 amma. And the wagon itself was 2.5 amma, meaning it was a total of 5 wide, and in between them was 5, and then you had another 5. Now, since the wagon itself was a total of 5 with the wheels, 2.5 in the center, 2.5 so the box itself was 2.5 wide, and then with the wheels it was a total of 5. And these beams were all 10 long, which means that it really only the middle 2.5 amma were on the box of the wagon, and then you had the bulk of it hanging on either side. So the Gemara asks, why do I need it to be 2.5 wide? It would have sufficed if the box itself was only 1.5 amma wide, and you had a total of 4.25 hanging off on each side, and it still would have traveled well. So the Gemara says, no, it would not be enough. We didn't want the beams to fall off at one of the bumps. And so 2.5 wide gave it more stability in the center. Now, Tues points out that we have a problem. Problem number one is that why would the Gemara ask to narrow it? 2.5 out of in the center of a 10 amma long beam is not great support as it is. So why would you make that even narrower? And always you want the bulk of the beam, the majority of the beam, to be resting so that it's less likely to fall off. Otherwise, the weight of one side can tip it easily. So why would the Gemara want it to be narrower? Additionally, the Gemara Tues is bothered by a few questions, one of which is that if we have 10 amma long beam on the one wagon, and next to it we have another 10 amma beam, and there's a total of 5 amma between them, so that means that the beams are actually touching each other and traveling that way. They're going to bang into each other without any gap space between them. So that in and of itself is a problematic. And in this image, I don't know if you can see it, you would see, according to Rashi, what it would look like as they're laying over the wagons, and you have almost no space between them, and they would hit each other. And so that's problematic. So therefore, Tues says actually what's going on is that these were conjoined wagons, and it looked more like this, where the total length of these two wagons were 15. They had a solid beam of 15 running across, and the 10-foot beam sat across the two wagons, which was 10 from each side. And what it means that there was 5 on the side was that it was 5 between the two wagons, totally between the boxes. And so this would be what the aerial picture looked like, and you can see the outline of the beam over here that would have been sitting on it, according to Tues' interpretation. Back to the Gemara. But the interpretation that we know, the halacha we know, is that a public thoroughfare has to be 16 amma wide. How do we know that it's 16 amma wide? After all, over here, according to Rashi, we had 20 amma wide, and according to Tues, it's only 15 amma wide. Either way, you don't have more than 15. You don't have the 16. Ananda Gamrina Lem Mishkan and Mishkan Chameser Hava, it was only 15. So Gemara says, Amsi Seira Hava, there was an additional 1 amma to have a Koy ben Levi, that one of the Levium would stand on the side of it. In case one of the beams started slipping off, he'd be able to push it back and set it in place. So according to Tues, it looked like that, and according to Rashi, this was he would get under it and put it back in place. Okay, so that's the end of this section with the Mishkan beams, and we now go back to carrying. I want to remind you of the halachas of some of the halachas of carrying that are relevant to this next Gemara. We have the 4 reshuyas, 4 domains in Shabbos. Doraisa domains are a public area and a private area. A private area is 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim wide. So it's 10 high, 4 square, and that constitutes its own private domain. And it has to have it be enclosed. So it either has, it's high, so it's enclosed, or it's in a pit and it will be enclosed. And then a public domain is a public thoroughfare, as we saw. It has many details, one of which is 16 amma wide, like we just saw at least. And the two rabbinic places, or really the rabbinic prohibited place, is the Carmelis, which is in between. It acts sort of, it looks like a public domain because it's not fully enclosed, but it really is a private domain or a makom pater. And then you have a makom pater. A makom pater is a non-entity space. It's not public thoroughfare. It's not a private domain. It doesn't have the requisite amount. So it's 10 tefachim high, but less than 4 wide. So it really can't be used as a private domain. So those are relevant. And the importance is that you're actually allowed to put something on a makom pater, an exempt place. However, obviously you're not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public or vice versa. But the criteria for a private domain is 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim in space. What happens, and this is our Mishnah's discussion, what happens if I have a boulder within the street, and the boulder is 10 tefachim high, and it has 4 tefachim usable on top? That would count as a private domain within the public space. And if you carry something in the public space, pick it off of the Rishus HaRabim and put it on that boulder, you would be chayev, because you carried from a public domain to a private domain. Even though it's not a private domain, it's just a boulder. It counts as a private domain in as much as it's 10 tefachim high, 4 by 4. Same as if you had a pit. You had a manhole. If it is 4 by 4 and it has it's 10 tefachim deep, that counts as a private domain. You carry from the Rishus HaRabim there or vice versa, it's going to be chayev. What's a classic case of that? A water well, right? The wells used to be a hole in the ground, and you had a little fencing or something around it, and that would be 10 tefachim deep. And if you carry water out from there into the public domain, you've transgressed Shabbos. Our Mishnah is going to tell us these two halachas, but it's going to add one point. That fencing that you have around the well, or if it actually is a mound of dirt, so when you dug out the well, you put the dirt around it, and now encircling the well, you either have brick layer or fencing, or you have a mound of dirt, they would constitute a part of the 10 tefachim. And they would constitute a part of the 4 amos, of the 4 by 4, according to Rashi. And it would combine to make it a private domain. So, Chulya Sabor, the edge of the pit, which is the dirt on the side of the this pit that was dug, v'hasela, or a boulder, shehin gavayim asar tefachim, as long as it's 10 tefachim tall, rechavan arba'a, and it has 4 tefachim in its width. If somebody carries from within that pit, or from on top of that boulder, or from on top of that ledge on the side of the pit, and puts it into public domain, or if somebody carries from the public domain and puts it into there, chayev, he will have transgressed Shabbos and brings a sin offering. Pachas mikam pater, but if it's any less than that, he will be exempt. Why does it have to say a boulder and a pit? Just say a pit itself. Why do you have to say the ledge of the pit? So this concurs with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan taught, that this pit doesn't have to be 10 tefachim deep itself. It could be the pit is 7 tefachim, and the dirt pile on the side of it is another 3 tefachim. Combined, you now have 10 tefachim deep, the pit itself, 7 tefachim, and then this mound on the side of it, another 3 tefachim. They would count as 10 tefachim deep, and as I said, according to Rashi, also the 4 tefachim wide. Tanya Nami Hachi, Indeed, we have a brisa that concurs with this. A pit in a public domain that's 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. You may not gather water from there on Shabbos. Unless you have a 10 tefachim high fence around you, so that makes it a private domain. And even though we learned earlier in the Masechta, and we'll see later again, this concept of within public use pits, that you can have just L-shaped corners to create that private space. That's not true in a private pit. And for a private well, you need a proper fencing. Oh, and not only may you not draw water up from there, you can't even lean in and drink from it because you may end up bringing the water to you and you're in the public domain. Unless you put most of your head and most of your torso into the pit and drink from there. And the pit and also the mound on the side of it will combine to make the number 10. And some say Rabbah. So Rav Mordechai asked the question. If you have a pit, a pillar in the middle of the public domain, so you have this beam. The beam is 10 tefachim high, 4 by 4. So now it constitutes a reshus hayachid, a private domain. If somebody throws something from the public domain, and it lands on top of that, okay? So I have an item that is in the public domain, and I throw something, and it lands on top of it. Now here's the problem with this. We know that the Reshus HaRabim, the airspace of the public domain only goes up 10 tefachim. So in order for this item that I'm tossing onto the beam that's in the public domain, which constitutes a private domain because it is 10 tefachim high, 4 by 4, when I toss it up, in order for it to land on top of that beam, it first has to go into the airspace above 10 tefachim, because there's no way for it to get up there without it first going up and then coming back down. So my strength, and this is the way Tues explains, my strength is I toss it upward. That's my power. When it starts arcing downward to land, my power ended. So where did my power end? Above the airspace of the public domain, in a space that constitutes makom pater, non-halachic public domain, and then it lands. So by the time it landed, it went through an exempt area. So even though I picked it up in a public domain and I tossed it upwards to land on this private domain, this beam in the public sphere, but it first went through the airspace. And not only did it go through the airspace, but it had to end my strength and start coming down by gravity onto that beam in that exempt area above the 10 tefachim of the public domain, which is the maximum height of the public domain airspace. So that's his question. Amud Rabim Gavoa Yud Rock of Dalit. You have a public domain 10 tefachim high post pillar that is wide 4. If I throw something up and it lands on it, mahu. What's the halacha? Do we say that you uprooted it, meaning you lifted it in the public sphere, and it landed in a private space, so therefore it's going to count as having picked it up in a public domain, carried it across the line, and put it down in a private space, in a private domain. Adilma, perhaps keep it in a makom pater, since it went in between into this no man's land above the airspace of the public Reshus HaRabim, the public domain, and from there it got its strength to fall onto the beam. So pater, I should be exempt. Makom pater because it's coming from an exempt space. And therefore I'm not obligated. That is our Mishnah. That says that I took something and I put it on top of the boulder. The boulder is exactly the same case, and it says if I put it on the boulder, it's going to be obligated. And obviously, if it made it onto the boulder, that means it came through the exempt airspace. Asa Shayle Rav Yosef. Well, he wasn't so satisfied with the answer, so he came and he asked Rav Yosef. He said the same thing. That's the case of our Mishnah of the boulder. Asa Shayle Abaye. He came and asked Abaye the same question. Amalei Masniti. He said the same thing. This is our Mishnah of a boulder, which is a boulder in a public domain. And if you put something on there, it had to have come through the private, the exempt area. You're all spitting each other's spit. In other words, you're saying the same words, but and saying over what the other said, but it's still problematic. Amrulay said, they said to him, you don't agree with this reasoning that our Mishnah seems to be this case, because the Mishnah is the case of a boulder in a public domain. And it says it's chayiv, so this pillar should be the same. But our Mishnah says if somebody takes something and puts something on this boulder in a public domain, it's chayiv. Amalei said, no, perhaps that's distinct. Why? Dilma masnita b'machat. Our Mishnah is talking about a needle, a tiny item that he could just slip on there. So what? It still had to get above the 10 tefachim, which is above the 10 tefachim airspace, in order to make it in there. So machat nami, even a needle. It can't be that it wasn't hanging down a bit. The islay mursha. As he says, no. Perhaps it's talking about that there's an indentation. There's a ledge off of the boulder inami derama becharitza, or there's a crack, a split in the boulder, and that's how you got it down without it. So it's in the ears. It's in the boulder itself constitutes a private domain, and I can slide it in there from the airspace of the public domain, because I can slide it in from below the 10 tefachim because there's a crack or there's some ledge there. And these all constitute as private domain because they're in the private domain. Amar Rav Misha Bayer Rav Yechon asked a question. Here we have a different question. The question is, somebody has a carmelis. A carmelis, again, being a non-biblical public sphere. So it's a non-biblical public space. So for instance, a park, or my front yard, which is not enclosed. And in any one of these areas, I now build a fence. And that fence itself is now what's going to create it's going to turn the, give me a second here, I'm just trying to find this image here. There. So I just built this fence, and the fence creates the private domain out of a carmelis. Prior to having the fence here, it would have been a public domain. A carmelis, in this rabbinic public domain, this in-between space. And because I built a fence, now I've created a private domain out of a halachic reshus yachid, out of that, my front yard. Okay, so my front yard is open. It acts as a carmelis because it doesn't have an enclosure. And now I built a fence. Now, if the fence was 10 tefachim high, 4 wide, it's its own private domain. However, this fence is 10 tefachim high, but only 1 tefach wide. So it independently, if that was just in the middle of the public sphere, that would then be a makom pater, an exempt area, because it doesn't have enough to be considered a domain. However, but over here, where it suffices to create to make my front yard into a private space, it itself should also become a private space. That's the Gemara's question. I have a wall that's 10 tefachim high, but it isn't 4 wide. So it itself cannot constitute its own private domain. However, it is now the fence that turned my Carmelis, my front yard, which looked open, and turned it into a private domain. When I throw something from the public domain onto that fence. Mahu. So what's the halacha? Me, I'm reading the Rock of Dalit, Mon and Who do I say? Look, it itself is not a private domain because it doesn't have the 4 tefachim wide, the minimum width it needs, the 4 tefachim to count as, let's say, 12 inches, to count as a private domain. And since it can't count as a private domain, it itself remains a makam potter, an exempt area. And if I put something on it, I'm exempt. Since it made my front yard, it made this area into a private domain, so that private domain is now completely fills the space, and it's as if this fence also is a part of the private domain. Amar Ula Kalvachomer. Ula says it's a logical thing. It has to be. It's a for sure. If for myself, for itself, it can turn. If it for others, it can turn it into a private domain. It can turn itself into a private domain. If it turns the property into a private domain, it itself becomes that for sure. It marnami. Indeed, we have a statement like that. Amar Rav Chia Barashi, Amar Rav, V'chen Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav Yochanan, Kossel b'Reshus HaRabban. If you have a fence, a wall at a public space, it's 10 tefachim high, but not 4 wide, so it can't constitute private domain Reshus HaYachid on its own. But it does cause something else to become Reshus HaYachid. Umukaf l'karmelis, and it envelops a karmelis v'asar Reshus HaYachid and makes it into a private domain Reshus HaYachid. Hazarek v'rachal gabav chayev, throwing onto it is going to constitute is going to be chayev, is going to make it into a public. Into a private space, and somebody carrying or throwing from the public sphere, from the Reshus HaRabban, onto that is going to be chayiv. The logic is, if it makes something else a public domain, for sure it can make itself a private domain. For sure it can make itself a private domain as well. Tomorrow.